Thank you, Pencho. Thank you to the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation for having me. It's obviously a great honor to be here, and I had such an amazing time last year meeting really interesting people. Of course, it's difficult to be speaking after Commissioner Breton, because as you said, he's a highly respected figure, especially in my country, and I really have a lot of respect for what the Commission is doing. Nevertheless, it's difficult because my perspective today will be a little bit critical of the approach that the EU has decided to go for when it comes to winning in the digital economy and the data economy. This you don't need to remember. So clearly everyone has heard, including in this speech, that the narrative of digital sovereignty, sometimes used as well interchangeably with technological sovereignty, has gone nuclear among policymakers in Brussels and also in some member states. I mean, this isn't necessarily new, but it's very much become part of the narrative of the current Commission. And what really is behind is a push for, some sort of a wish of the EU to leverage its regulatory power, and some even call that the Brussels effect, by rolling out a toolbox of policies and strategies, which you can see some of them here, that aim to regulate emerging technologies and technology platforms. And those proposals include the data strategy, which I will come to in a minute. Now, the drivers behind this is that the EU sees itself caught between a rivalry between China and the US and digital sovereignty. It's sort of its way to exist within that space by increasing domestic control over technology. Now, what is it in really? I mean, it's been defined multiple times in various different ways, and many reports some of you have read, many speeches we've heard, but this is sort of what I took from at least the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. Now, I am European, but I'm also French, and so it's cool. It means culturally, I grew up to see sovereignty as a very important concept, as you might guess, judging our history here. But being French also means I enjoy being a contrarian and some sort of a gainsayer just for the sake of the intellectual argument. We find that very stimulating, right? So even if I understand that the concept is very appealing and I'm very attached to it in a way, I'd like to point out that there are few things that are wrong in the way the concept is being framed and implemented in policy. Taking as an example the data strategy. Now, what is data sovereignty? Because we talk about digital sovereignty, but this is more specifically data sovereignty and data ownership have become part of the equation as well. So what the EU wants to do is to own the data, to regulate it, to protect principles that it holds dear, such as data protection and privacy. We've just had the chance to hear Commissioner Breton on this. We've heard him many times saying, the data belongs to Europe. It should stay in Europe. It belongs to us. It should be processed here and stored here. I also heard him say in a television show on BFM TV and was it, French TV channel, that the Chinese do it, the Russians do it, we should do it as well. So it's clear that, in a way, that suggests the EU wants to adopt portions of the Chinese orientations to control the data, especially the data that's being collected from big US-based platforms. But some are raising legitimate concerns about how this can be counterproductive and how this will not necessarily help the EU become an architect of global power and a leader in the digital economy. Typically, the EU does a better job at making rules than at playing power politics. So if this whole narrative remains a paper tiger that will not impress a country like China, it's not because the rules are written in the EU that it will benefit its tech sector. It's not because the EU tried that strategy and thinks it's been successful with the GDPR that it should try to replicate it to all other areas of the digital economy. And it's certainly not because the Russians and the Chinese and the Americans sometimes do it that we should do it as well. I think we should carve out our own approach and not try to be a follower of existing models, especially those representing digital protectionism. And we should not aspire to win with this sort of models. We should not respond to foreign protectionism by serving protectionist interests and becoming protectionist ourselves. What does the data strategy call for? I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, so I will not spend too much time on this, but basically the idea is that we create a European common data space market for data with a shared set of rules, and the goal is good and ambitious. I'm really pleased that we're encouraging B2G and B2B data sharing. It's necessary, it's essential in the digital economy, and there are many mutual benefits. However, it's important that policymakers, whatever they do with the data strategy, they ensure it is compatible with existing rules, that it clarifies how implementation will work in practice, that it does not impose more costs and compliance costs, especially on companies, and that it rallies the participation of our allies and other partners and non-EU stakeholders in general. The success of the implementation will very much depend on the credibility of the project, and that means you need to be clear as to how that will work in practice. For now, some people are still very skeptical about how clear that is, so I think that will be a first step to persuade others to join the projects of the EU data strategy. Second, commercial data sets often include personal and non-personal data. If you think of a data space like the financial one or the healthcare one, it is inevitable that you will have a mix of both. And so you'll have regulatory schizophrenia between the GDPR that restricts in some way the collection and sharing and use of data, and on the other side, a regulation or a framework that encourages it. You'll have to separate data sets. How do you do that? It is expensive. It will bring more legal uncertainty to companies. There will have to be a lot of arbitrages to be made, and that can lead to delays and higher costs. Third, the strategy says we need cloud providers operated in Europe on the grounds that US cloud providers are not secure or trustworthy. But storing a data within a country's border does not make it more secure or more trustworthy or private. And non-EU cloud providers already respect the GDPR because you have to do so when you want to do business in the EU. Plus, a lot of them already provide the option to their customers to store their data in Europe. Another point I wanted to bring up is that we're pushing for data localization here in the hope that it will support the success of our firms. But the success of those firms very much still depends on a secure infrastructure which the US cloud providers are best equipped to give us. How do we think we can build cheaper, better, maybe more energy efficient clouds ourselves? And in the middle of a recession, how will you convince companies to switch to new cloud providers, let alone that we have a legacy of failed industrial projects and cloud projects like Quairo, which are very wonderful, but they wasted public money and they injected basically free funding to industrial laggards just for the sake of battling US tech platforms on a territory where we don't necessarily lead. The most important cloud providers in the EU are still American. I mean, you have OVH, you have Orange, Deutsche Telekom maybe, but basically the biggest ones. These are still where companies go to because they can provide scale, they have the capabilities that are needed. A problem with the data strategy, especially one of its projects, which is GAIA-X, is that it will restrict voting rights, it will restrict access to decision-making to non-EU companies. Now, when I hear Commissioner Breton say that this is not protectionism, to me that looks very much like self-preferencing. We have a data economy that's very much collaborative by nature. So it's not a Vegas rule. What happens in Europe stays in Europe, what happens in Vegas. This is not how it works. So, and eventually you will have a technology that will be harder and more expensive to sell and to use. This is not the right way if you want to ensure that, access and development of your products are shaped around your values. Another point that I wanted to bring up about the data strategy is that it seems to mandate data hubs as if the private sector is not capable of providing those data spaces itself. But that is not true in all areas of the economy. You have pharmaceutical companies that are already sharing themselves voluntarily through self-led initiatives, data, clinical historical data with researchers, including their competitors. Next, funding. Where will we find the money? 4 to 6 billion euros are needed for this project. Now, that was before the recession, and it is not clear how we will mobilize this, how we will allocate it to the different data spaces, for what purposes, and whether that will serve to cover maintenance costs, which will be quite important. Another point we heard from Breton today is that we want to create personal data spaces to provide more control to people over their data. But that, that doesn't say who will help them, use those new spaces, who will provide them, and whether they will actually want to use them. It also doesn't account for the cost and the feasibility of the project. Data portability makes it easier for consumers to share their data. Yes, it's good for innovation, but that can also require companies to provide complex, disparate data sets over many years in a reusable format. So that could deter companies to collect and store data in the first place. And then a last point, data quality seems overlooked. It's great to have a lot of data, but that doesn't mean you'll be more competitive because the type and the quality of the data matter. The expertise is important. It would be like assuming that the banking system that has the most Excel files is the strongest. So you need an innovation for all this. And data quality is in turn something we could win with to address concerns about AI when it comes to bias and discrimination, for instance. So last piece of my presentation is how do we, take the high road and make this data strategy stronger and really credible. We should not waste our efforts sidelining other priorities like addressing the lack of interoperability, the lack of common standards, which is essential for better data sharing. We should not overlook that we have a much needed adoption of AI by our businesses. Only 42% of them in the EU have adopted AI against 85% in China. We should not overlook that we need to transform our labor market, that we have a lack of human capital supply and a lack of digital literacy. Our AI PhDs that are trained in the EU don't stay here. So these are the main things, but there's also addressing always the same thing, the fragmentation of the digital single market. We still don't have a truly domestic consumer market that our companies can work with. We still have diverging IP rules and diverging licensing agreements, for example, lack of financing of existing innovation, lack of VC investment, lack of digital entrepreneurship climate and mentality as well. We should look at smart data initiatives, data trusts, and other such voluntary data sharing model to improve the collection of data, the quality of data, and to encourage companies to collect their data responsibly. Also, we could look at memorandum of understandings and cooperative agreements with trading partners, because if you talk to each other early on in the pre-standardization phase, then you will not have all these principles baked into our approaches, and then they become politicized, and then it's more difficult to find a common arrangement. So if you have those data sharing frameworks built in collaboration more at the global level, or at least with our partners, it would create more confidence, more understanding, and interoperability of data sharing approaches. The EU should also maybe make it more explicit that it is committed to digital free trade. And really sort of enact it in its provision as the global preferred standard. So that's another thing that's essential. And if it wants its principles to make headway and shape the norms around technology, the EU should try to align with its allies and create some sort of a digital allied sovereignty. If it wants its values to carry any weight when it comes to countering China's authoritative model, then I think this is our best chance. And former NATO Secretary General Rasmussen said himself, inviting them to form a technological alliance of democracies, because if we set our own standards, then that will make it more difficult for Russia or China to overlook those principles. We need cooperation rather than isolation, or just a focus on more regulation. Otherwise, we're not going to have the capabilities and the funding that we need to compete with autonomy in the digital economy. We'll be running with handcuffs instead. What's the point of sovereignty if that disincentivizes your allies or your partners to do business with you or to invest in you? So the EU, final word, has very ambitious goals. I am very proud of it in many respects. It's a big bet, and at least it's taking real matters in its own hands when so many are lost or missing in action. But we need to solve our existential crisis and gain more of a digital self-confidence. And I will just end up with this proverb that I like to use: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Europe first isn't bad, but it shouldn't be Europe only. Thank you so much for your attention, and thank you, Pencho, and thank you.
Many thanks. Shall we take maybe one question from?
Sure.
Is there
if I can.
some open questions? I believe there are many open questions, but maybe we can take one. Chivot, please.
I was going to ask, what then do you do about the people working in the Web3 space, i.e. in crypto, blockchain, and people who desperately don't want to, are making technology that start devising storage systems. Oh, sorry. Okay. They can't hear at the back. I'm pretty loud. Shall I repeat the question?
Yeah, because
okay.
you mentioned that some are creating or
there are people
data outside of the frameworks.
Right. For example, there are people who are working on, and fairly successfully, decentralized storage. So it can be stored anywhere, and they don't have control over. And geographic location doesn't make any sense at that point, and they don't have any control over that anyway. So how do regulators stay ahead of that game, or understand it at least?
Why do you have to regulate everything? If for some areas of the economy, it's not necessary if it works well, if it doesn't break rules of data protection, for instance. I don't think that the involvement of government is always necessary for every type of data sharing space. Some actors are doing it very well already with their own industry-led practices and initiatives. Does that answer your question?
Well, you sort of answered it by saying, what if it doesn't break rules? What if it does break rules?
If it does break rules, then we should go after them, obviously. It's like with technology. Why regulate a technology or a system or infrastructure like cloud when you should just regulate the conduct? It's the same with the use of AI, for instance. AI itself is not risky. It's the use of it, the way companies behave. If you think of the diesel scandal of Volkswagen, what was wrong is the company's ethics, and that's fine. Let's sanction that, not necessarily the technology behind it or the approach. So, if you're not convinced, we can have a chat after.
Maybe one more short question. Do we have? No, regarding GAIX, maybe. We have some initial success. What's crucial at the moment? What do you think?
I think one of the points that I raised was about the clarity and the specificities of who can get involved and how. Why restricting the access to voting rights to non-EU providers, to some of them. So I think, and the funding, I think that would at least bring more credibility immediately to the project.
Many thanks.